Welcome back to Motivational Moments. I am your host, Metzger. Today's episode is going to look a little bit different than the ones previously because today's episode and the ones following hereafter will be on video as well as audio. Therefore, that will make it more accessible to certain groups of people, being that we all consume content differently. Initially, when I came up with the topic for today's episode, I was going to discuss with you the theory of universal design, but after realizing that this week marks the 30th anniversary of the Americans With Disabilities Act, I determined that that would be the focus for today's episode. So what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? The Americans with Disabilities Act is a piece of legislation that was initially put into law in 1990, and there have been several other pieces of legislation, such as the amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act, which took effect in 2008, as well as other forms of legislation that are specific to sectors such as education and other areas. So basically, the Americans with Disabilities Act focuses on the employment of people with disabilities and their integration into society. One of the main points regarding integration is access to public transportation so that people with disabilities can lead independent lives. When considering the ADA, one of the important things to highlight is how it applies in education. So, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's something known as a reasonable accommodation. And so, a reasonable accommodation, in my own words, and hopefully I can communicate it in such a way where it makes sense, but a reasonable accommodation is a modification to the way a product, service, or environment is currently made to make it accessible to a person with a disability. And one of the main tension points within the way the reasonable accommodation is written is because if it is determined that the reasonable accommodation poses a fiscal burden on an educational institution or an employer, then they can say, oh, that's not a reasonable accommodation. But some examples of reasonable accommodations or things that the ADA does cover is accessibility buttons in educational institutions and other public settings. So, like, when you go to the gym, oftentimes you'll see accessibility buttons, or in healthcare facilities, but my hope is that accessibility buttons will become more common in society, such as businesses that aren't public entities or that are not required to have those buttons, because the buttons are symbols of inclusion, and when you frame it that way, it really helps people to understand that these buttons provide access, and when those buttons are present, I can actually I or other people with disabilities can navigate environments independently, and we can actually open a door for someone else and let them walk through first without having to have them open the door for us. So that's really awesome. And in terms of my advice for people and educational institutions and businesses in terms of how to make environments accessible is to plan for these expenses as a budgetary item. So accessibility buttons, or if you're an educational institution, I would recommend that you create 2 endowments and work with your university advancement team. And the first endowment would be for environmental modifications, such as getting more accessibility buttons, or even putting them at places that aren't required under the ADA but would increase the accessibility of the campus, such as on secondary entrances or an entrance that's not a primary one. And then also for more specialized accommodations that are not normally a budgetary item but necessary on a case-by-case basis, so that you can make environments accessible to individuals with complex disabilities, such as if vocational rehabilitation did not provide my transcription service, that would be something that those funds in that particular endowment could also be used for. The second endowment that I would recommend that educational institutions have, specifically higher education, is an endowment focused on disability-specific scholarships and supporting students with disabilities in addition to their academic scholarships, because certain types of disabilities, such as those with individuals with needs related to mobility or other physical challenges, we can't participate in athletic programs if they're not. Some schools have athletic programs that are designed for students with disabilities, but when those athletic programs are not available, I would really like to see schools have scholarship funds to support individuals with disabilities as they pursue their education. And so, yeah. So over the past 30 years, progress has undoubtedly been made to take steps toward people with disabilities being integrated into society. However, there is still work to be done, just like there is for other populations, as we are currently seeing in our culture. But there are a few different models of disability that I want to highlight in our conversation today. So the first model of disability is the medical model. And so the medical model at its core says that medical professionals are necessary in order to minimize the impact of a person's disability in society. And so this is the framework that the Americans with Disabilities Act in some ways still embodies, even though there's been 30 years of progress, because they put limitations on the amount of support that people with disabilities can get. And then if you go above a certain level of income, those supports go away. And so that's what, I mentioned this in the previous episode, but that's why so many people with disabilities don't fully, are not equipped to go to the level of potential that they really have, and so they go into occupations to where their skills are underutilized. And so the social model is a much better approach, in my opinion, because at its core it says that people with disabilities are unique individuals, and it recognizes that there's variation in terms of human ability, and so it allows for better integration, but it still has its downfalls. And so just recognizing that people with disabilities are unique as individuals, and we aren't defined by our mobility devices. We're unique individuals, and yes, we do need certain supports, but with support we can function in society. And so to people that are not disabled, or those who have a disability, this is also an important reminder. But I always like to tell people that individuals with disabilities are not aliens from outer space. We come in peace because we all have challenges, no matter if we're disabled or we're able-bodied, but everyone's challenges are different. And so that's where my philosophy on disability, framed as a specialized challenge, comes from. And when the medical model is embraced, it kind of oppresses someone's sense of identity, because basically it's saying medical professionals are necessary to minimize the impact of your disability. Therefore, it doesn't see a person as valuable for who they are. And so that's where the social model is a much better approach. And it's also important for me to highlight that there is a typical pattern that that people follow as they grow up. And so when the current support system for people with disabilities isn't designed to allow people to move away from their parents and become independent without having to jump through all these hoops, that's what discourages people from doing that, or what poses barriers. And so that's where the continued work is necessary, to strive for a support system that accounts for the variation in terms of ability by recognizing that even among able-bodied people, there is a difference in terms of what able-bodied people are able to do and what they're not. And so that's at its core what needs to happen in terms of reform. And so in the next episode, I will dive deeper into the topic of disability by looking at a theory called universal design, which I mentioned at the conclusion of the previous episode. And so I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm sorry it went a little bit longer, but I hope that the new format will increase the authenticity, being that I am not reading from a sheet of paper. So let me know what you think of today's episode, and if you have questions or suggestions for a future episode, feel free to email me at mason@masonmetzger.com. Check out my new website, which was recently relaunched and redesigned, which is masonmetzger.com. On my website, you will find a link to my YouTube channel and all my other social media platforms, as well as the audio and a link to the video for today's episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I appreciate your support. And remember that you are unique and you have the ability to make a difference. Have a great day.